Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our service this morning. This is the Redeemed Christian Church of God Agape House here in Nashville, and we welcome you all, those in the sanctuary here and those who are joining us online. We often start our service with the Sunday school, but this morning we are doing something different. We're having a kind of discussion, and we have an important guest here today to help us on this subject. As you know, February is the Black History Month, and we are right at the end of February, and so we want to round up the Black History Month with this talk. So this morning we have in our midst somebody I would not call a guest because he's very well known to us. He's part and parcel of our church, and that's in the person of Professor Moses Ochono. He really needs no introduction, but I will say just one or two things about him. Professor Ochono is a scholar, a distinguished scholar. He's a faculty in the History Department at Vanderbilt University, where he also holds an endowed chair. He's a versatile writer. He has published many books, and I actually have one of the books right here. This book is called Colonial Meltdown, Northern Nigeria in the Great Depression, the history of northern part of Nigeria during the Great Depression. Very interesting and scholarly book. You may want to purchase a copy. He has written other books as well. We are glad to have you here, Professor Ochono. I'm the interviewer, and by way of introduction, I'm Professor Adebayo Yebade. I'm also history professor at Tennessee State University, where I'm also the chair of the department. So I want to go quickly into the discussion this morning. And we also like audience, taking part in this discussion. Let's talk about the origins of Black History Month. What brought about February being designated Black History Month? Can you tell us, basically the history of the Black History Month to start with?
Sure, sure. Thanks. So, Black History Month, as we know it today, started not as Black History Month, but as actually Black History Week. The first Black History Month on record was celebrated, I believe, February 1926. So, in 3 years' time, we'll be celebrating the 100 years anniversary of this celebration. But it's in February. The short answer is that in 1925, a group of African American intellectuals and scholars gathered in Chicago. And the leader of that group was a famous African American scholar named Carter G. Woodson. Lots of things are named after him. There's a Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia today. So he gathered a group of black scholars and historians, sociologists, and so on, and said, why don't we celebrate black achievement? Why don't we see how far blacks in this country have come since emancipation in 1865, right? So right around the 50-year mark, so it's been 50 years since blacks were free. Why don't we come together and try to celebrate how far we've come? Let us display and exhibit evidence of black achievement. So they gathered in Chicago for an entire week, and that celebration involved museum exhibits, inventions by African American scientists, artworks. There was actually a big exhibition. So it was a huge success. It attracted African Americans from all over the country. But there was a sense that the celebration should not just end there, that it should continue. And in the closing remarks, Carter G. Woodson said, we have to keep this going. We just can't make it a one-time event. So that really is the origin of Black History Month. Later on, he would tour the entire country, encouraging churches, black organizations, fraternities, black fraternities in HBCUs to continue the tradition of celebrating black achievement. So it actually became known as Black Achievement Week. The reason it's done in February is because it was decided, Carter G. Woodson decided to choose the birth month of Abraham Lincoln because he authored the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the blacks, but also February is also the birth month of another African-American hero, Frederick Douglass. So those two people. So later on it became known as Negro History Week. So it was still celebrated weekly until, to cut a long story short, until 1976, when a group of, at that time, Carter G. Woodson was dead because he died in 1950, but they continued the tradition, and then they changed it from Negro History Week or Negro History Month to Black History Month because Negro fell out of use. It became a negative word, and the preferred term became African American. And the last thing I'll mention is that throughout these transitions and evolutions of this celebration, one organization was behind it all, the Association of Negro Life and History, which later became, and still exists today, as the Association of African American Life and History. So in 1976, it became recognized officially as Black History Month, and also it was a time to celebrate not just black achievements now, but to celebrate black history and to go back to the history of slavery, emancipation, the black resilience, and so on and so forth. From 1976, when it became official, US presidents, successive US presidents, Democrats and Republicans, also began to declare and celebrate it with an official theme, sometimes even in the White House itself. So that's a very summarized, a highly summarized version of the story.
Yeah, thanks so much for that history of the Black History Month. I'm glad you mentioned the reason why February is Black History Month, because people often say that February is the shortest month in the year, that just a talking, But I'm glad that you clarified that. I believe that Black History Month should not just focus on the issue of blacks in this country, African Americans. I think even the issue of African American history is an integral part of African history. It's a continuation of African history. So I was wondering, you mentioned Carter G. Woodson and some other African American scholars. How about on the continent, the pioneers of African history? You want to say one or two things about them, people like Kennedy K and the rest of them, their contribution to historiography of African history?
Yes, so it's, Black History Month in this country is celebrated with a view to also looking at the history of Africa, because there's a recognition that whatever happened in Africa or still happens in Africa reflects either positively or negatively on the history, on black people in this country. So during all of these celebrations the original celebrations through the 1950s all the way to 1970s, there was always this emphasis on, we should always go back to the beginning. That is the history of our ancestors on the continent. We shouldn't just focus on history after slavery, after our ancestors were brought here as enslaved people. We have to go back and look at. So African history has always been a big part of this celebration. So if you go, for instance, to the exhibits, the museums and the exhibits dedicated to African American history, the curation always starts from African history, from pre-colonial African history. And we've had a lot of people who pioneered that history. Kenneth Dike, Tekinata Muno, J.K. Ade-Ajayi, and so many other giants who pioneered the writing of African history at a time when white colonizers claimed that Africa had no history, that Africans didn't make any history, didn't have languages, didn't have civilization, and so on and so forth. There's the Ibadan School of History, there's the Dar es Salaam School of History, there's the Legon School of History. all of these schools of African history popped up in the 1950s to correct this misrepresentation of the history of Africa. And thanks to their work, I think African American history has been enriched as well. The reason being that African American history no longer just starts with the history of enslavement on this side of the ocean. Anybody who teaches African American history usually now begins from the source, from the beginning, in pre-colonial Africa. Yes.
Yeah. One of the greatest African American scholars wrote a book called From Slavery to Freedom. What's his name now? John Hope Franklin. And he was criticized for that title, From Slavery to Freedom. African American history did not start from slavery. Started from the time when, they were living free lives in Africa before being enslaved in the New World. So now, Black history is actually an acknowledgement, celebration of Black experiences and achievements and so on. Now, that takes us to the utility of history. I think what we are saying presupposes that history has certain utility, value, functionality, and so on. And we know that in this country, some of my students will always tell me, well, in African history class, we didn't learn anything when we were in high school, and so on. So that has not been part of the curriculum in high schools in this country. And even back home, I don't want to mention countries, I know a country in Africa that actually banned the study of history for a while. That's why you have universities, they merge history with other disciplines. Department of History and International Relations, Department of History and Philosophy, and so on. So there's actually a downward trend, in the functions of the study of history. So what can we do at all levels, nationally, even as individuals, to promote Black history, to understand Black history?
Well, that's a great question. Aside from, obviously, some of us who are educationists, apart from teaching it in the classroom, we often have personal, private encounters with people, and we should seize those opportunities. We should, use those encounters to try to correct misrepresentations of Black history. Because this is 2023, and you'll be amazed at how much misrepresentation and misunderstanding still exists regarding the history of Africa, the history of Black people in this country, the contributions of Black people to the history of this country. African American history, Black history is American history. And even today, it's still very hard for some people to accept that. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So I personally, I use my online, you mentioned earlier that I'm active online, in online communities, social media. That's one platform that I use sometimes to propagate the importance of Black history, the importance of historical knowledge generally. Because I think that, if you don't know your history, you don't know who you really are. You need to know both the good and the bad side of the history, the traumatic side, so that, you make sure that it doesn't happen again, that trauma doesn't happen again. But also, you also need to know the inspiring side, so that you are inspired to accomplish and to fulfill your promise, despite the obstacles placed in your way. And we have, trauma in African American history, but we also have amazing inventions, amazing accomplishments, amazing stories of resilience and heroism. So all of these things are important, especially in a country where we are minorities, right? History is critically important when you're a minority, and when there's the majority establishment is bent on reducing your political clout and your political influence, and is bent on marginalizing you socioeconomically. History becomes this weapon that you can brandish, especially if you know it well. You can brandish it and counter all of that, all of those plans.
Yeah. You made a statement that I want to really emphasize. that if you don't know your history, you don't know who you are. And that's absolutely true. You are more or less a non-entity. You are a non-person if you don't know your history. You got to know your history so that you know who you are. One of the prominent European scholars, E.H. Carr, said, if you don't know from where you are coming, you don't know where you are going. It's just you are just lost. I'll come back to the audience, but I want to shift the focus of this discussion to a controversy on the state of Black America today. There is that perception, that in some quarters, African Americans have been so slow in making gains, in making progress since emancipation. There is that perception, And there's another one that, look, we have to look at the history of Black people in this country. You have to look at the history of enslavement, the trauma of enslavement, the psychological trauma. We have to look at post-slavery period, Jim Crow segregation in the South, to me, which was more or less another period of slavery. You have to look at racism at this, presently. So what can you say about that? Those who have said that, look, African Americans are not doing well, they are not making progress, and so on. What would you say about that?
Well, it's again, Exhibit A for what you were describing as the lack of knowledge of history or the absence of the knowledge of history. I think it's too reductive, it's too simplistic. I think, when people say, oh, well, slavery ended a long time ago, well, that's because they don't know what happened after slavery ended. Slavery ended a long time ago. African Americans should be doing better. They should quit talking about slavery. But slavery, people forget, was not an event. It was not like an event that just started and ended. Slavery, I would say, was continued by other means. And many of our people, unfortunately, don't know this. So I'll speak on that shortly. So I think when slavery ended in this country, when it was officially ended, African Americans didn't own land. African Americans didn't own property. And there was active resistance to the emancipation, especially in the South, right? One of the things that the South did after the emancipation, they hated it. They hated Abraham Lincoln. They just were kicking and screaming, was to reestablish slavery by other means through something called convict leasing. Many of us may not have heard about it. Convict leasing was a process whereby African Americans, Black people, convicted of crimes, put in prison, were basically given out to private businesses, private plantation owners, to work for them for free. In other words, slavery continued by other means. If you've heard about mass incarceration, there's a lot of discussion about mass incarceration today in America. That's the origin of it. It also meant that because the Southerners were determined to continue slavery by other means, Black people were 10 times more likely to be convicted of crimes because they knew that if they ended up in prison, they would become free labor for white people. So any flimsy, any slight excuse put especially Black men who could work, who were strong, put them in prison. That's the origin of mass incarceration. So how can a race of people progress when, quote unquote, slavery ended, but then you replace it with convict leasing? So I have other examples of how every time the Black community started to make progress, started to, acquire wealth, they will be shut down, they will be put down. The white establishment will intervene. KKK, the origin of KKK. KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, started in Tennessee. Some of us find that fact uncomfortable, but it was founded but the reason, why was it founded? Yes, it was founded by racists for racist reasons, but it was founded primarily to keep Black people down because white people felt that with the emancipation, suddenly Black people could own property, they could farm, they could acquire wealth, and they would start to compete with them. They will start to compete with them for jobs, they will start to compete with them for resources, they will start to get loans to build homes, They didn't want to see that. They didn't want to see any evidence of black progress, any evidence of black economic equality. So KKK was formed to terrorize blacks. They would attack their businesses, burn the businesses down. They would attack black communities in their homes in the middle of the night to chase them off of their properties, to chase them off of their lands. And guess what would happen? White people would quickly move in and claim those lands and claim those properties. So they were forcefully, KKK was a racist organization, but it was meant primarily to take away what belonged to blacks, to stop them from progressing, to take away what belonged to them and to give it give those things to white people. The way the white people in this country at that time, especially in the South, felt was that there's something called zero sum. Zero sum means that if you gain something, then that takes it away from me, right? It's not a win-win situation. That's the way they saw it. Like, if black people were making progress, were acquiring wealth, were progressing, were becoming doctors and lawyers, then it meant less resource and less progress for the white. That's the way they saw it. So KKK was one of those instruments. The other example that I want to give is something called Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877. In that period of Reconstruction, believe it or not, the Southerners were reluctantly forced to accept black equality through a series of laws passed by the federal government. Do you know that during that time, in that 12-year period, we had black senators? Yes, we had black senators in the US Congress, black House of Representatives. Black people made so much progress in this country. They built businesses, vibrant businesses. They built good schools, hospitals. You know, they acquired wealth. Some of them owned large farms. They made so much progress. But guess what that did? It planted jealousy, envy, and anger in the minds of the Southern whites. These black people who used to be our slaves, look at them now. They're taking away our jobs, they are going to be like us someday. So they had to make a move to stop Reconstruction. The Southerners struck back and forced the federal government through the Compromise of 1877 to abandon Reconstruction, right? And the Southerners celebrated, including in Tennessee here, they celebrated that they've stopped these people. They celebrated widely. And guess what they did? After that, the coast was clear for them. They instituted what they call the Black Codes, you know, and which later became Jim Crow laws, right? These laws were meant to prevent blacks from accessing jobs, legalizing discrimination against them, segregated the public parks and public institutions, and so on.
So from voting, they couldn't vote.
Exactly. They denied them access to voting rights, civic rights. Everything was taken away from blacks. You couldn't own property, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the final example that I have, 1921. All of these things are very highly summarized versions of history. So go look it up. Go Google. Google is your friend, please. There's no excuse now. We're in the age of social media. So I'm just giving you summaries. Go and research for that. The last example is the Tulsa Massacre, 1921. This is probably the most convincing example. Every time the African Americans made progress, the whites would come in and shut it down. Tulsa Massacre happened because there was this part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, that became vibrant, became prosperous. Black people built it. It later became known as the Black Wall Street. Why? Because they had banks, their own banks, they had their own hospitals, their own doctors, their own grocery stores, their own pharmacies. It was like 30 blocks, city blocks, half of the city, because there was segregation. So blacks stopped patronizing white grocery stores. Blacks stopped patronizing white banks. And so what happened in the white community? They said, wow, these people are going to be independent of us economically soon. They are no longer coming to get loans from us. We can no longer exploit them. They are no longer coming to buy grocery stores from us. They have their own stores now. They have their own pharmacies. They are no longer coming to our doctors. They are spending money in their communities now. They had their own hotels. They had their everything. Guess what? In 1921, they found an excuse. There was a misunderstanding between a black man and a white woman in an elevator. That's it. And the white people, out of anger and jealousy and envy and all of it built up to the moment where they saw an opportunity, they mobilized, they armed themselves, and they attacked the black community. The whole of that Greenwood neighborhood was burned down. 300 blacks were killed, 800 were wounded. The properties of black businesses were looted. Yes, looted. All of this happened in 1921, Tulsa Massacre. If you don't do anything, I'm giving you an assignment. Go and look it up. If you forget about everything else that I said, please, this one is very important. Go and read up on it. It will give you new perspective on this question of, why are African Americans not doing as well as whites? And why, are they always talking about slavery? So go and look it up and do the research. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for extensively dealing with this issue and clarifying it. Also, the issue of sharecropping, that was more or less re-enslavement of African Americans, after slavery and all other examples. Let me just go to the audience. I have one more question, but let me just go to the audience. We have two people now. Larry.
Hello.
Thank you very much for
2
the
minutes.
enlightenment. So just a question. So as we look at history, obviously, just like you said, it serves no purpose, going forward if we don't know the history. So knowing now what we know and, enlightening people, how do we go forward, with everything now that we know? And I'll just give example. When things bad happen in the past, there's a tendency sometimes to go towards the path of hatred, when one is looking at history. So, and then you talked about, during one of the digging deep also, you talk about the psychological effect. And some people, again, have a ready-made excuse as to the reason why they can't progress in life. So how do we go forward, having knowing what we know, how do we go forward in the black community to ensure that we don't have hatred and to ensure that, we are helping people to, go through the psychological effects of, some of the things that have happened in the past?
I think in the interest of time, I would just like to say that you can use history in two ways, especially traumatic history. You can use it, you can allow it to weigh you down and to make you angry, but you can also use it as a challenge, as an inspiration to say, I'm not going to let this history repeat itself, but I'm not also let this history defeat me psychologically. I'm going to succeed in spite of this history, but also because of this history. Precisely because of this history, that is why I'm going to forge ahead and succeed. So in the interest of time, that's I'm just going to say.
Yeah, let's just take a question from here.
Thank you so very much. My question is, it's good to teach history, but you have to make sure you're teaching the relevant history. Sometimes my kids say that what they teach them is different from what they know. So my question is, who determines the curriculum or what exactly is taught? I'm asking you as an educator, and does the campus, the university kind of tell you to the extent of which history you're going to teach? Because they've been teaching this for years, and still, a lot of us are still just learning. Thank you.
The answer to that is long, but we don't have time. But I think the short answer would be that, we live in the South, so that places all kinds of constraints on the public school history curriculum. And there's a whole debate going on right now. There's all these controversies. They are trying to roll back the teaching of African American history, the teaching of black history, the teachings of slavery. People are uncomfortable with this history. But history is supposed to make people uncomfortable. So I think those of us who maybe teach in the university, we have that liberty to teach it. So unfortunately, as Professor Oyebade said, we get a lot of people in our classrooms who were taught wrongly. I'm just going to be blunt. We are in church. They were taught wrongly, so they come to us, and we have to correct, we have to do the hard work of correcting them, of resetting their brain, and correcting all the misperceptions and misrepresentations of history. I have a lot of African descendant students, like first generation immigrant kids in my class as well. And they'll say to me, this is the first time I'm hearing this. Even my parents didn't tell me that. Well, because, and nobody taught me this in high school. So we just have to do the work, but also parents, teach your children the true history, correct them when they are wrong. But you can only correct them if you Google, like I said, Google and do the research yourself. If you don't do the research yourself, you won't know the difference between the right history and the wrong history. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been so interesting and educative, but unfortunately, we do have to end here because we can't exceed time. I know discussions will go on, after this. Professor Shoni is around, he's always around. You can talk to him or talk to him, me. So thank you so much for being our guest this morning. Next year, Black History Month, we'll also have another session. So thank you, everybody.